Hello, and thank you for joining us. Today we are speaking with Dr. Walter Lee here from Virginia Tech. And Dr. Lee is the Associate Professor in Engineering here at Virginia Tech with research interests in inclusion, diversity, and educational equity, improving STEM learning environments, co-curricular support, and research and developments in student success. Dr. Lee, if you could take a moment to kind of give your kind of personal background and kind of the personal journey that's brought you here to Virginia Tech.
Will do. So I'll start where I went to undergrad. So my higher education journey started at Clemson University, where I got my bachelor's degree in industrial engineering and a minor in sociology. So the reason I mention both is I've always kind of had this dual interest, not only in the STEM and technical space, but also in people. So that led me to choosing the discipline in engineering that involved people the most directly in industrial engineering, but also kind of supplementing that with sociology. So I would regularly basically take a sociology course, one a semester, to kind of keep that human element front and center. And then in industrial engineering, we also spend a lot of time talking about the basically like the intersections between people and the mechanics. So whether that's in manufacturing and thinking about the workers, or thinking about human computer interactions or other things related to human factors, those have been my two passions. And then along the way, I realized that there was a field called engineering education where I could merge those more explicitly and start actually doing education research in the context of engineering. And that led me to Virginia Tech, where I pursued a PhD in engineering education, but then again, supplementing that with a master's in industrial systems engineering, with an emphasis on human factors, so that again, this time I could lead with my interest in people in education research and social scientists, but then also supplement that with some of the more technical engineering courses. But I have intentionally tried to keep both of those things moving along the way. And then after I finished my PhD, I was in a unique opportunity to remain at Virginia Tech. So there was we were hiring multiple tenure track faculty. So I think that year, I think there were 3 of us that were hired. And it kind of, the timing worked out very well where I was able to apply for that position and become a faculty member. And I have been at Virginia Tech ever since.
Cool, cool. One thing I'd like us to talk about today are what you feel, kind of broadly speaking, the duties and responsibilities of professorship are, and how you have seen those duties change over the course of your academic career, and how you expect those duties to change going into the future.
So the context for the way I'm going to frame my answer to this. So I'm currently teaching a course called Graduate Student Success in Multicultural Environments for the College of Engineering. And one of the things in that course we talk about is aligning your expectations with faculty members. And I think through teaching that course and having the conversation with incoming graduate students about what faculty do, how they might need to think about faculty, how they might need to approach their relationship, like that's provided the context for my initial response to the statement you just put forth. So I think that I view like our responsibilities. So I think you could view it in like the typical way of like teaching research and service. We're here to teach some classes, we're here to do some research, and we're here to provide service. And I do think that applies. And I think really as it relates to our interactions with graduate students or undergraduate students, the way I talk about it in that course is we regularly wear the hat of mentor, supervisor, and advisor. And I do think that as a faculty member, it probably is your job to mentor some people, to supervise some people, to advise some people, to teach some people. And I think we don't expect you to be that to everyone, but I think that if you're fully contributing to the university mission, that I think that you probably will be doing some form of those things to someone and kind of lending your expertise in a variety of formats. So not just teaching people in the formal context where you have a class, but like not just only advising students that you're assigned with, or not just supervising students, but like also mentoring some students. And I think when you pull all those things together, I think you have a faculty member who is kind of fully pouring into the mission of the university and really making themselves available to students' development in a variety of ways.
One thing that I want to talk about a little bit in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion are outreach initiatives. And this is something that I've been thinking about a little bit, and I've been in conversation with a number of my colleagues in the geosciences. Geosciences specifically lags behind other STEM fields, both in terms of gender and racial equity and representation within the academia, essentially all levels, undergrad, graduate, and faculty levels. And one of the ways that we seek to combat that and correct that is through different outreach opportunities. And I'm involved with a number of outreach opportunities. And one problem that I see with I don't want to say all because I think that that's unfair to a lot of the outreach that people are involved with, but that I see with some outreach is that in some ways it doesn't necessarily do a great job of reaching people where they are. And because of that, it's limited in how broad a community that it can reach. Like, so for example, I helped with a high school science competition called Science Olympiad. And that organization was really helpful for me personally because it allowed me to essentially study geosciences on my own in high school in a context that, I didn't have courses on. And I suspect that that's probably true for a lot of people, not just in geosciences, but in other things too. But to do that, I had to take part in Science Olympiad, which is an organization that, only exists in schools that have a team. And it's difficult to have such a team, and not every school does. What kind of outreach initiatives do you think will do a better job of, getting more broadly representative cohorts of students into different STEM fields and other fields in general in undergrad?
It's a complicated question to answer, primarily because I have a complicated view of the value of outreach. So, I think that it's important. I don't know if it's necessarily transformative enough to see some of the shifts that sometimes we put on its shoulders. So, to be more specific, I view outreach as kind of expanding the breadth of people who realize that the thing that you're offering or the thing that you're pursuing is a possible, it's an option. So I think that it can raise awareness. But one of the reasons that I don't necessarily think that solves the problem is I don't think that the fundamental problem that we have as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion is an awareness issue. I think that might be the case in some contexts where there are people who are already in school systems and have access to the resources that if they were aware and they were interested, they could pursue it. But I think at a large context is that the structure of opportunity in the country is not such that if we just made everybody aware that we would do it. But I do think that as an individual person, I do think that it is a way of giving back. And I don't know if that answers your question fully.
I think that it's a valuable perspective in that, I agree with you that outreach is important, but at the same time, it can't be the only thing that you can do. That kind of leads naturally into discussion of so-called leaky pipeline of kind of the graduate school and faculty direction that we see drop-offs in representation and representativeness from undergrad to grad school and then from grad school to faculty. Do you think that from what you've seen of different universities, do you think that universities are both sufficiently aware of this leakage and are taking steps to try to plug the leak, so to speak, and make it more representative at different tiers?
I think they are aware of it. I don't think that lends itself to people trying to plug the leak. So this is interesting that you bring this up. I actually have a paper talking about the use of the pipeline metaphor and what that says about broadening participation and when you should use it and when you might not want to use it. And one of the points I make in that paper is the value in the pipeline metaphor is that it makes it clear that there's an issue on the supply side, which has some pros and cons. So if your goal is to highlight the issue on the supply side, then it is very useful to direct people's attention to that. Because if you're a graduate program director, you're talking about the pipeline, it does make people look at what undergrad ed is not doing. But at the same time, as if the problem actually does lie with you, that specific metaphor or conceptual framing doesn't necessarily prompt you to think about your role in the leaky pipeline for whoever's behind you. So graduate programs don't necessarily think about how they are the leaky pipeline for faculty as much as they think about how undergraduate programs is the leaky pipeline for them. And I think when people use the metaphor, there is a lot of pushback on it. Some people don't like it for that reason because they realize that it's often used as a way to redirect blame as opposed to necessarily position their own selves as it relates to the problem. So yeah, I feel like I get far away from your question.
Well, that's fine.
I read most of the critiques I come across. And I think the difference in my view is some people are arguing that the language itself is problematic and we need to completely get rid of it. Where my view is more so is it's one way of looking at the problem. And there is some truth to it, because if you do look at the supply side, there are issues and people are not graduating enough at pretty much any level. Like anyone could make that point. But I think that sometimes we don't necessarily leverage our imagination enough to know that like that is one framing. And if your goal is to be self-reflective and think about your own role, that's probably not the correct framing to use. And like you'll hear people talk about STEM pathways and STEM learning environments and ecosystems. Like I think just being real clear about what we can see and what we can't see when we use this metaphorical language, I think is something that we don't necessarily always pause to think about. Like, wait, is this language hiding something, or is it actually illuminating the thing that we're trying to talk about? Which I think is important to pause. I just don't necessarily go as far as saying completely just never ever use that metaphor.
Again, kind of broadening out, not just from engineering, but looking at kind of the broader STEM ecosystem. Why do you think that there are, differences in representation of different groups within different STEM fields? Like medical science and medical research tends to have better female representation than do other STEM fields. And as I alluded to earlier, geoscience in particular tends to have relatively poor representation of different racial and ethnic minorities within the different levels. Where do you think that these kind of structural differences emerge?
I think they come from a lot of different ways. So I think in one case, I don't operate under the assumption that the goal is for everyone to be spread out equally everywhere. Because like I think in order for that to happen, society would have to not be gendered, not be raced, not be classed. And I think as long as those things exist, I think we're going to see some unequal distributions of people deciding to go in certain places. And I think those are for a lot of reasons, as well as like geographical reasons. Like it's not that people are picking careers at random to the point that if I showed you 100 kids and it was like 100 Black kids, 100 white kids, 100 Asian kids, 100 Latinx kids, like if society didn't have anything, like there was nothing about the structure that was race, gendered, classed, or based on ethnicity or anything, then you might assume that people would just randomly end up in the same places. But I think in a context where those things do exist, even if we did have equal opportunity, I think you would still see some unequal distribution. So like the mere fact that everyone doesn't have the same distribution that we see in the country, like to me, that doesn't necessarily register as a problem to the same extent that I think it does for other people, not automatically on the surface. But I think that some of it has to do with the fact that people in different groups and that live in different cultures and are in different countries, like I think all of that just leads to some people making different choices to some extent. But then I think we also have an opportunity structure that has taken away some of the choices for some people. So I think when it comes to race and ethnicity and class, like because our K-12 system is so segregated and tied to the income where you live, I think you see those inequities manifest in different ways. Whereas when you're purely talking about gender, because like the men and women and non-binary people within a community theoretically have access to the same schools and stuff, I think you see the gender representation issue manifest slightly different. And like there are some studies that, like I've seen a paper argue that one of the reasons some majors don't have more women is because that the people that go in the major tend to just be good at math. And when you see the women who are good at math, they're also good at English, and therefore they have more options. Like I've seen people rationalize the distribution in a lot of ways. And I think it is different depending on what department you're talking about. But I do think it's a combination of the way society is structured, the way we have opportunities attached to things like race and ethnicity, the way we have gendered certain professions, the way we gatekeep stuff. Like I think there's a whole lot of things that manifest in us seeing different representation in different fields. And I think it's like, I don't know if there's like any one thing I would attribute to what you see in any specific field as much as like there's just some combination that you could probably use to rationalize why like biology looks different than chemical engineering, which looks different than electrical engineering. Like I think you even see this within the subdisciplines. Like we're not just randomly going in places. So there's going to be some level of distribution that I think we're going to have to be happy with. I think the harder part is really figuring out what are the circumstantial things that we need to remove so that those aren't the barriers, but then also figuring out some of those metrics. And I think you'll hear with deans, like they might have to figure out like, as it relates to women participation, like is the goal going to be 50-50? Should it be 30? Should it be 40? And I think it's hard to set those metrics. I think most people can agree that wherever they're at right now is not good enough. But I think what success looks like, I think is tricky. And thus what the problem is also becomes tricky to pinpoint down for certain people.
So in terms of how academia is changing and responding to it, what kinds of actions do you think more departments should take? And do you think that are there certain universities or systems of universities that you think are doing a better job of approaching these issues than others?
I think there are universities that are doing better jobs than others. I think a lot of it just has to do with how much of a priority it is. But in general, I think we have to just revisit some of the central processes at universities. So like the admission process, whether that's done at the department level or the university level, like whatever process you're using to decide who even gets to have access. Like I think that's a prime site for why we see some of the numbers we see, because people are making decisions about what we consider qualifications, what we consider merit, what the cutoff is going to be, how many people. Like I think all of those decisions ultimately manifest in a lot of ways. And I think sometimes that's within people's control, sometimes it's not. At the grad level, that looks very different than at the undergrad level. So at the grad level, individual faculty have a lot of power. So if you have a faculty that looks a certain way or is from a certain place, you're probably going to end up with graduate students who look very similar just from the nature of people having the opportunity to recruit. It's like if you look at my research group, it looks very different than my college research group. And like that shouldn't surprise anybody because I have complete control over what that looks like. And so it manifests in very different ways than if the College of Engineering was deciding at a high level who they thought was qualified to join the program.
This is just an aside about qualification, but I want to phrase this very carefully, but I think one of the silver linings of kind of the disruptions to standardized testing that we've experienced because of pandemic lockdown is that, you know, more graduate programs are moving away from the GRE. And I personally think that the GRE is a terrible, terrible thing. So I'm glad that departments, including my own geoscience department and other departments, are moving away from that specific test as qualification and are looking at other models of assessing qualification.
Yeah, so I think so like the GRE is one way that shows up. Which universities we view more favorably. So if you're a faculty member and I gave you 10 applications and you see like Harvard and Stanford and Purdue and Michigan, and then you see some lower tier universities, like because we kind of use those as proxies for quality, I think that also creates an issue. You hear about this a lot in industry when people talk about not being able to find diverse talent, and then they're like, where do you recruit? And they're like, oh, we go to Stanford, UCLA, and X, Y, or Z. And you're like, yeah, there's a whole lot of other places you could look. If you only look in the same places, you're probably only going to see what talent they have to offer you. And that talent might not be representative of the country. So like, I think just the way we source talent and evaluate it, like I think that needs to change.
That's one that I'm sorry to kind of keep moving things to geosciences away from engineering. It's just what I'm a little bit more familiar with. But one thing that I think geoscience departments are often well positioned in is, you know, geoscience departments tend to be a little bit small relative to some of the other science departments at the universities that they're at, but geo departments also tend to be receiving departments in that they often have students who didn't start out as geoscience majors, who are transfer students from other schools. And I know that major geoscience departments often cultivate very tight relationships with local community colleges. Like I know that my department head, he's worked very tightly with regional community colleges to make it easier for students to transfer from community colleges to our geoscience program. And I know that that was also a focus of the department back at UGA, where I did my geoscience undergraduate degree. And so I think that, you know, being kind of more open and more able to work with outside of kind of what we see as the main universities is good for, you know, helping students get into the kinds of things that they want to do.
Yeah, and I think that's a clear example of, instead of saying there's an issue with the pipeline, it's reframing it to think about like, how can we open up pathways to my major? And then that might be, can I go start relationships with this school? Can I go start relationships with these students? Can I think about other ways of making it more seamless and accessible to get to our program in the first place? And I think that people will see some changes whenever they do take it on themselves to critically interrogate kind of the front end of their process.
Are there any kind of takeaway messages that you'd like to give the audience in terms of things to be aware of when thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in engineering and in STEM more broadly?
I think we have to resist the urge to assume there's going to be like silver bullet or panacea to solve a lot of these problems, and just embrace the fact that because we're in a country where there is so much difference amongst groups, and as we make more progress, people who have been on the short end of the stick are just going to get more vocal. So like I think it might feel like things are getting worse sometimes when sometimes things are getting better, providing space for people to tell you just how bad things were.
Mhm.
And I think we just have to not look for shortcuts, not be afraid of the discomfort, not be afraid of redistributing resources. Like, I think we're just gonna have to really lean into doing some of that work. And like, I think if someone wants to do the work, they're just gonna have to be comfortable with it moving slow at times, feeling like they're up against institutions that say they want things to change. It might be hard to get buy-in from a lot of people. It might be complicated. You might get it wrong sometime, and you might be on the other end of someone else's outrage. And I think a lot of that is just a part of doing the work. And I think that people have to lean into that and not be afraid of being corrected or not be afraid of having to carry the load for a little while if they really want to do the work. Because if you look at history and all the people that have been doing the work, like it's bound to happen that way. That's what it's going to look like. None of this is going to change easily, regardless of your context. But I think people just have to constantly be in that mind frame of like, what could we be doing better? Who's being excluded? How can we make this better? Like, I think that constant self-interrogation and focus on continuous improvement it just has to be a part of your mindset, and it just has to be how you view the world in general.
It's not something that can be solved or suitably addressed through a series of committee meetings over the course of a semester or a year.
Nope. Nope, it has to be built into the foundation of what it is you're doing. And if it's not, then it might be revisiting policies and practices and how you like the culture and mindset of people in this space. Like, I think there's a lot of work. It's not like the amount of stuff that has to change to see different results is just a lot. And sometimes it's a lot more than people are willing to change.
Well, thank you for your time and your perspectives today, Dr. Lee.